Hello, and welcome to this breakout session. My name is Nadia McLaughlin, and I work at the National Center for Education Statistics at the U.S. Department of Education. I am the project officer for item development for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, also known as NAEP, and oversee development efforts for the various NAEP subject area assessments. I will be hosting today's session and will also be moderating the question and answer segment following the presentation. I will take questions from the chat space provided, so please type your questions in the chat. Resources related to this presentation are also available on the website resource file. Now for the exciting part. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Carol D. Lee, who is a professor emeritus of education in the School of Education and Social Policy and in African American Studies at Northwestern University. Her research addresses cultural supports for learning that include a broad ecological focus with attention to language and literacy in African American youth. She is a current and former IES grant recipient, currently for her work on sense-making in the disciplines, argumentation in literature and history, and formerly for her work on Project READI. She is the president-elect and member of the National Academy of Education and is also a member of the following organizations: American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Reading Hall of Fame. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, the National Conference on Research in Language and Literacy, and the International Society for the Learning Sciences. She has led 2 international delegations in education on behalf of the People to People's Ambassador Program to South Africa and the People's Republic of China. Her career spans a 55-year history, including work as an English language arts teacher at both high school and community college levels, a primary grade teacher, and a university professor. She is also a founder of 4 African-centered schools that span a 48-year history. This session has been pre-recorded, but we will join you live for the Q&A at the conclusion of Dr. Carol Lee's presentation. With that, I now turn this over to Dr. Carol Lee for her presentation on a systemic conundrum, targeting outcomes of comprehension in the absence of conceptual epistemological processes, literary reasoning as a case.
My name is Carol Lee. I am a professor emeritus from Northwestern University, and the title of my presentation, A Systemic Conundrum, Targeting Outcomes of Comprehension in the Absence of Conceptual and Epistemological Processes. I know it's pretty long, but I want to focus this specifically in terms of the reading of literature. The presentation basically has 4 sections to it. I'm going to go through these slides much quicker than I should, but I'm trying to cover a lot of territory here. One, I want to start by focusing on what we learned from the science of human learning and development and its implications for thinking about reading comprehension. Then to go on with a brief overview of just basic issues around reading comprehension, and then to make the specific case for literary reasoning and implications for teaching in middle and high school, and then try to illustrate the points I'm trying to make very briefly from an empirical study. So I'm arguing that the foundations of human learning and development are essential for how we think about reading comprehension, and that we should think of reading comprehension as a particular form of human learning and development. And because of that, I think that the understanding of reading comprehension should be situated in what we know from the science of human learning and development, and the implications for practice should be derived from those foundational principles. So these big ideas about human learning and development, I would argue, are coming out over the last certainly a decade of work in cognition, human development, the neurosciences, cultural psychology, ecological systems, and dynamic systems, that there are a set of core ideas that are converging across these disciplines. First is the notion that of interlocking dynamic systems, that learning doesn't occur simply inside the head of an individual, but rather is coordinated through the kinds of resources that are available as people participate in activities in across spaces. The idea that that social interactions are central to human learning and development. cognition and social, emotional sort of perceptions and experiences are central to how we engage in all activities in our lives, that these are filtered through our perceptions of ourselves, our perceptions of others and tasks, that these influence our goals and efforts, that culture is central to all human learning and development. There are lots of ideas around culture that we need to interrogate. I won't be able to go into this in terms of the time constraints here, but hopefully we can pick it up in the Q&A. And the whole notion of person, process, context, kind of ecological systems theory, that human learning and development are an outgrowth of attributes of the persons interacting with social processes within and across different contexts. So the big takeaway here again is that perceptions drive our thinking. They drive the emotional salience that we attribute to experience. Nyla Nazir, Roy P., Maxine McKinney DeRushton, and I have just finished editing a handbook of human, cultural foundations of human learning. And I have derived from that something we call the RISE principles of learning. The idea that learning is rooted in evolutionary, biological, and neurological systems. It is integrated with other developmental processes that involve emotion, identity, and cognition, that it's shaped in culturally organized practices across people's lives and experienced as embodied and coordinated through social interaction. So just to dig down a little bit deeper into those core principles. The first idea that human learning and development are rooted in physiological processes and dispositions that we inherit from our evolution as a species. The argument here is that that we have evolved as a species through the way in which our bodies sort of interact, if you will, with our environments, including the physical environment, the social environment, the emotional environment. And because these are outgrowths of our evolution, we ignore them at our own peril. That these physiological processes and dispositions have both individual variation and uniqueness, as well as species-wide characteristics. This is really very important because as we talk about issues of culture and sort of group membership, it's also very important to recognize individual variation at the same time. That these physiological processes and dispositions, including genetic dispositions, unfold through people's participation in cultural practices, including social interactions. There's a whole field of epigenetics that has documented the ways in which genetic dispositions with which we are born, this has been shown in animal studies, can be moderated through participation in cultural practices. That cultural practices have both continuity and change and are both homogeneous and heterogeneous simultaneously. Again, this is very important because we typically have a kind of static view of people's participation in cultural communities. And perhaps most important, the notion that malleability is a central cornerstone of development. This conference is concerned with this persistent challenge in terms of evidence of reading comprehension over time, particularly among particular populations. And so understanding malleability is absolutely essential to our work. What we take from these principles of human learning and development are the following features of robust learning environments. One, that they position the learner as competent. This is really important in light of the kinds of data that we are wrestling with in the field, that we anticipate sources of vulnerability, but also we examine and scaffold the resources that the learner brings. Learners always bring resources. Our challenge is understanding their relationship to the focus of our goals in reading comprehension. I'll try to illustrate that as we move forward. That we make public the social good and utility. This is very important in terms of the notion of relevance. Why am I engaged in these practices? To make problem solving explicit in public. This is an issue that I'm going to try to address in some detail, because I think one of the challenges in our field is that our instruction is largely focused on outcomes of comprehension as opposed to processes that provide supports as learners are engaged in complex problem solving. Again, very often instruction is in looking at outcomes, are asking kids about responses after they've been engaged in the practice as opposed to supporting them as they're involved in trying to make sense of text. Robust learning environments provide expansive opportunities, but also remain adaptive and dynamic. So now I want to switch to just a brief overview of basic constructs in reading comprehension with which everyone here certainly is very familiar. So when you think about what I'm calling an integrated model of reading or a holistic model of reading, where clearly prior knowledge is relevant, the effort that people engage in to make sense matters, certainly knowledge about language, vocabulary and syntax is very essential. These influence fluency, the ability to decode, metacognitive processes, being conscious while you're reading, particularly when you get stuck in engagement in comprehension strategies. At the same time, it's important to recognize, in light of what I was discussing earlier, that reading is a relational skill. That is to say, the relationship between the reader, the text, and the context matters. It's not a static skill. Each of us, even as expert readers, have always had the experience of having to wrestle with a text that we don't understand, often a legal or medical text, for example. That the progressions of difficulty across grades are not based on simple readability formulas. This is very important, I think, for example, in terms of RTI attempts in school around reading comprehension. And if we look at Common Core, they tend to want to argue that things are going to shift by grades, but what they shift rather is that the nature of the text change, the nature of the task kids are asked to engage with change, and the demands, particularly post-primary, are discipline specific. And that's why I want to engage in this illustration of literature. And so we need to be able to teach both generic reading strategies as well as discipline specific strategies, knowledge in the domain, and sort of dispositions of inquiry. This issue of text complexity, again, is a very central issue in terms of reading comprehension. Older sort of views of text complexity focus solely on the text, but newer work argues that the sources of complexity in reading comprehension are an outgrowth of the demands of the text in relation to the task that we're trying to engage, what the reader brings to this, as well as the context in which this activity takes place. They're also important, I think, in terms of understanding social and emotional demands of reading comprehension, wrestling with uncertainty and complexity. It's very important that kids learn that the fact that you begin to attack a text and you're not quite sure what it means, it's okay. Being able to wrestle with competing demands while you're engaged in the act of reading, the perceptions of yourself and others in terms of your ability to carry out the work, the nature of the task, and your relationship with peers and teachers in there and their perceptions of the setting. Again, the overarching argument being that reading comprehension is not simply a intrapersonal cognitive activity. Certainly the cognitive demands involve constructing, testing, and revising as we read. And I think this is really important in terms of implications for teaching, that understanding is a process of unfolding over time, of recognizing when we don't understand, continuing to read in order to repair that at some point, hopefully, what doesn't make sense now will make sense. Integrating what we already know with new information gleaned from the text and adjusting our attention and effort in relation to our goals for reading And then the notion of taking stances while we are reading in terms of a critical stance and being able to interrogate and question authors, that these are all sort of cognitive dimensions, if you will, of reading. So with that as just a very brief background, I want to turn attention to the specifics of reading in the domain of literature. That literature, I'm arguing, has particular affordances, particularly in terms of, as we think about social and emotional demands of reading comprehension. Literature invites us to interrogate human conundrums. Literature can offer powerful ways of helping young people think about pathways of resilience to challenges that they face in their own lives. Literature invites us to enter narrative worlds, make-believe worlds, like we'll look, for example, at movies and science fiction when we know, at least we think we know, that these worlds don't perhaps exist, but we enter the world as if they do. To be able to enter diverse worlds, I would say that in our interconnected world today, and certainly in our contested society presently, being able to enter cultural worlds that are not part of our experience are one of the important affordances of literature. And also this opportunity to examine language in very nuanced ways. I was involved in an IES-funded project called Project READI with Susan Goldman from University of Illinois at Chicago. And in that work, we developed a general kind of overview of the kind of categories of knowledge, if you will, that are involved in reading in the disciplines. One being epistemology, so that each of our content areas involve particular ways of thinking about what counts as knowledge and how do we know, what kinds of questions are valid to engage, particularly inquiry practices and reasoning strategies. So excuse me, ways in which claims and evidence are established. How do we argue to support that evidence supports claims that we're making? There are overarching big ideas that characterize each of the disciplines, different kinds of text, different genres of text, different kinds of representations characterized in the disciplines, and certainly different ways of using language. So what we've done then is to apply that framework to the domain of literary reasoning, so that in terms of epistemology, we want children to learn that reading literature provides an opportunity to interrogate the meanings of what it means to be human, to value the idea that they can be in dialogue with both with readers, text, and authors, and also very important, an epistemological orientation to valuing not only content, but form and structure and rhetoric, which I'll try to talk about in some detail going forward. Key concepts involve moral and philosophical content, the historical context under which texts are written, the traditions of critical theory. So reading from a reader response saying that my perceptions matter, excuse me, from a feminist perspective, etc., and valuing intertextuality, the ways in which texts engage and talk with one another. And also in terms of kinds of text, this is really an important distinction here that we would argue. This is based largely on work from George Hillocks, that we can think about genres in literature as involving particular kinds of plot structures. And so when you read a text, for example, and recognize it as a fable, then you recognize that the animals are intended to inhabit human personalities and to act as humans might, as well as genres that are based on different kinds of characters, such as the trickster or the epic hero, the tragic hero, etc. In terms of using language in literary reasoning, we want children to learn to understand and value and pay attention to imagery, to problems of figuration, such as symbolism, irony, and satire, to be cognizant about problems of point of view. Who's telling the story? Can we trust what that character is telling us? Also, to pay a particular attention to rhetorical strategies that literary authors use to get our attention, such as parallelism, contrast, repetition, understatement. These are all teachable strategies, or what we're calling rules of notice, as well as poetic devices. And that the outcomes of what we want kids to do and understand about text certainly have to do with understanding the unfolding of events and how they're connected, the understanding the motivations and psychological states of characters. And these are certainly sources of complexity. Understanding how authors use structure and rhetoric to communicate ideas, and then certainly to draw on prior knowledge that the reader brings in terms of the social world of the text. So in terms of big ideas, if you will, or areas of focus in the teaching of literature, we would argue that attention to archetypal themes, loss of innocence, truth, justice, etc. Attention to what we're calling interpretive problems that are teachable in terms of heuristics and strategies, such as how do you detect symbolism, irony, satire, etc. And when you detect them, what do you do to try to make sense of them? Attention to ways in which stories are organized, such as coming of age stories and fables and allegory, etc., as well as attention to character types. What you will notice, however, here is that we're not talking about genres in the way that curricula typically do, that is short stories versus novels versus poems. Prior knowledge is very important in reading comprehension, and there are specialized ways that we can address prior knowledge in the teaching of literature at the middle and high school level. One involves what I'm calling scaffolding heuristics. In my own work, the framework that I've developed over the last 20 some odd years called cultural modeling, we've argued that narrative is endemic to the human experience. And so all of our children come to school with experience in interpreting narratives they hear, that they see on TV, at the movie theater, and song lyrics, etc. And that we can draw from those everyday genres and help young people to become cognizant of strategies that they typically use in a tacit fashion. In addition, literature involves interrogating themes and evaluating kinds of characters. George Hillocks developed what he called gateway activities, where kids would be given scenarios and surveys in order to help them to articulate criteria that they would use for making judgments about themes or particular kinds of characters. That close reading of literary texts involves story grammars. Again, there's lots of early work, Nancy Stein, Tom Trabasso, and others, about children's fundamental understanding that stories involve people with psychological states and goals, engaging in activities. These underlying schema kids come to school with already. The ability to teach kids how to detect the indicators of typical genres around different kinds of characters and different kinds of stories. What we call, this is based on Peter Rabinowitz's work, rules of notice in literary texts, such as prominent positions or repetitions or disruptions, that these are signals that authors will often use to gain our attention. And these, again, are teachable strategies. And the ability to develop forms of representation for children, young people, to be able to represent through, for example, graphic organizers that are specific to these literary problems, their attention to these prototypical problems and the kinds of strategies that they're engaged in to make sense of them. We can also, important in this work, to socialize norms within the classroom around argumentation and close reading, so that students in class, excuse me, are building sort of databases over time about through what I'm calling these heuristic organizers of following plots and characters and noticing the unusual, the use of annotation of text. The heuristic organizers that I'm talking about are organizers, not the typical ones that we see, which are most often connected to expository text, but organizers that we can develop that guide students into following characters, into following plot, into noticing what is unusual and making interpretations of them, developing ongoing experience with argumentation, both in oral discussion, writing, and other forms of external representations, and helping kids to develop language through things like sentence stems and use of academic registers in order to communicate their ideas. Also in socializing epistemological dispositions around discussion and the writing of essays, for example, where we teach kids to value that claims must be supported with evidence, that being uncertain is a good thing and not a bad thing, that we can have different points of view, particularly in the interpretation of literature. That's the name of the game in literary interpretation, and creating conditions in which students take ownership of their engagement by themselves posing questions, by having to work initially individually to put effort in, and then moving in to share their ideas with others. So now I'm going to sort of close this section out with just a very kind of brief example. This is a opening chapter from Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, where, sorry about that, we're told that there's this fully dressed woman walking out of the water, and all these strange things we're told about her. And in this example, which the video is somehow not abbreviated, you get just the beginning of it, but in a class, this is me teaching many years ago, you see I don't have gray hair at that time, where she has gone through the kind of preparation that I've talked about with the cultural data sets, with the gateway activities, with these socializing norms, and has read this opening chapter and has noticed something very important. You can hear this. Now, for some reason, my video stopped playing. I don't know why, but I wanted you to hear just that section, in that she's a speaker of African American English, and she communicates this big idea of what she notices, that there's something very unusual going on, and that engaged in her use of African American English, she's deeply sort of committed. She's entered this world as though we're all there watching this woman coming out of the water, and is doing exactly what we would want in terms of an epistemological orientation and attention to structure. One of the other important pieces I think that has come out of this work for teaching is the recognition of the distinction between the oral communication that young people have when we are able to sort of loosen this genie out of the bottle, if you will, in their engagement with literary texts, and helping them to make translations after the oral discourse in written form. This is just an illustration of my attempt to translate her kind of emergent understanding into what would be a more expert-like representation. So another big aspect of this in terms of teaching has to do with how we assess how kids understand works of literature that we're teaching. And I'm arguing for sort of categories of kinds of questions so that we would, in a standard way, develop questions around themes. We would develop questions around what I'm calling structural generalization. And this issue around arguing about symbolism, for example, is just an example of a structural generalization question. That is, you're focusing kids' attention on what about rhetoric and structure in the literary text draws their attention, and what significance do they attach to that. The traditional ways that we're thinking about sources of text complexity, I would argue, are only valuable for perhaps purposes of sort of decoding and fluency access to text, but they really don't get at the complexity of text. The short story, The Flowers, for example, which would be at like a fifth grade level is concerned. It's a very short, it's really a one paragraph story. The sentences are very short, but rhetorically and structurally, it's still very complex, and the ideas behind it are very complex. So another important aspect of this work, I would argue, is how we then think about sources of text complexity. If things like Lexile are not giving us the level of information that we need. So that I would say that our sources of complexity in literary text involve plot structures, for example, when plots are chronologically in order versus where you have inverted chronology, for example. Problems of the complexity of characters, the presence of these interpretive problems, problems of point of view, archetypal themes, that we could use these in some sense as areas that teachers ultimately, I would argue, need to examine to understand what are going to be sources of complexity. So around genre, as I said, linear versus inverted chronologies, what kind of prior knowledge is required for the theme, and also issues of the developmental appropriateness of the theme in relationship to the students. How do we understand the complexity of the characters? Are they unidimensional, multidimensional? What are the problems of point of view that are in the text, and what kind of rhetorical tools are there? So heuristics. So here we've drawn from the work of Peter Rabinowitz and what he calls rules of notice, typical ways in which authors attempt to draw our attention through privileged positions such as titles, repetition, exaggeration, understatement, etc. So if we're going to prepare young people to engage in complex literary texts, that we certainly need to build requisite prior knowledge, such as the gateway activities and the cultural modeling data sets that I talked about. That an example of strategies for symbolism involve, again, noticing titles when it seems reasonable to reject the literal. In Tupac Shakur's The Rose That Grew Out of Concrete, we know roses don't grow out of concrete, so that would suggest that the meaning is something other than literal. When there's a great deal of detailed attention, it's often these are indicators of symbolism, and that the strategies involves capturing the actual text. What associations do you make with the kind of language in the text? What do you see as similarities between the two, and then extrapolating from that to what you think might be significant. So this is an example of a cultural data set on unreliable narration. I'm sorry, I'm going to go on through this very fast. Or rap lyrics, we've used a lot in terms of everyday cultural data sets. So I want to close very quickly with just some core, try to illustrate in an empirical study how we've tried to bring these big ideas together. Again, this comes out of an IES-funded project called Project READI. This was a 4-year longitudinal study where we were focusing explicitly on positive racial socialization and healthy psychosocial development in the context of teaching kids to interpret literature. This issue we've talked about before about the role of perceptions and cognition and emotion in terms of the population with whom we were working, we argue were filtered through race-related threats having to do with negative stereotypes, low expectations, and competing challenges. This was at a high school when kids had lots of things going on in their lives. We drew theoretically in this work, both from my own work in cultural modeling, but also the work of Margaret Beale Spencer, what she calls PVES, Phenomenological Variant of Ecological Systems Theory, where she basically argues that resilience in the face of challenges is an outgrowth of the nature of the supports, and this informed the design. We collected a great deal of data in terms of psychosocial measures about kids' sense of identity and coping and efficacy, their perceptions of the instructional climate. We had outcome data in terms of assessments we developed, as well as the assessments that the district used and kids' grades, et cetera. The focus of the work was around this issue of kids wrestling, using literature as a way for young people to wrestle with the question, who am I, what can I become, and what are the challenges that I face through literature. We're working with an African-American adolescent population who faced risk certainly by virtue of the sort of history of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, even unto today. We argued that these adolescents had to wrestle with multiple challenges. One, just being adolescents, living in a racialized society, having in high schools to wrestle with decontextualized demands of reading in across the disciplines, while they're managing peer social relationships, et cetera. The one example that I've often used in this work is a story that was on public radio about a young man named Mikael at Paul Robeson High School, where there were the broader ecological influences of during No Child Left Behind. The Chicago Public Schools determined that kids who were failing as freshmen were likely not going to graduate, and so there was pressure on this brand new teacher, Mrs. Ring, as an English teacher. Mikael wasn't doing his work, so she stopped teaching the novels because she couldn't get the kids to read, and gave them worksheets. And then on Friday they could make up, so they found Mikael with another kid copying the worksheet of his friends. And then finally, Mikael gets inspired because his mother tells him if he passes the class, she'll get him a ticket to a rap concert. But it just represents, we think, just the broader kind of ecological context in which all this work takes place. What we know about the history of negative discipline, particularly with regard to African-American students, and particularly African-American males. We asked these young people about their experiences with trauma, and you can see the vast majority of them had some experiences with trauma. When we asked them where did they go for help, they went either to their mother or to their friends. Going to their friends meant they weren't getting the kinds of supports that they needed. And our feeling was that literature was this opportunity for them to begin to wrestle with these challenges. What we found was that there were psychosocial variables around the kids' perceptions that they could adapt to challenge, their comfort with their own racial identity, and their belief in sort of group membership and power were positively correlated with their reading growth in their reading scores from 1 year to the next. We had measures of epistemology, and we found that valuing multiple meanings and of literature and valuing the social function that literature could play was positively correlated to the kinds of tasks that we asked them to engage in. We also found that there was a strong correlation between their skill sets in reading comprehension and writing with the kinds of school climate and classroom climate features that we had tried to develop. So in conclusion, the takeaway, I hope, is that we've argued that reading comprehension is not simply a cognitive activity, that reading comprehension is not simply situated within the individual, that robust learning environments must address the multidimensional nature of reading, must make strategies explicit and support their use while reading, must distinguish between asking students for outcomes of comprehension and supporting students in engaging in processes of making sense of text, must address the specialized demands of reading in the content areas, must anticipate sources of vulnerability as well as sources of strength and resilience. And that as professional practice, we must be organized and supported to investigate the constraints of current standards, assessments, and commercial materials. With that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for that wonderful presentation. I think you provided some great examples that people can take forward and think more thoughtfully. So we are now entering the live question and answer phase of this breakout session. So welcome, everyone. As Kaylin mentioned in the chat, please enter your questions in the chat box provided, and we will ask those questions of Dr. Lee. So I thought we would start off this Q&A session with a question for you, Dr. Lee, as folks are thinking of their questions and entering it in the chat. So what are participants' experiences with assessments that provide teachers and schools with actionable data on how students tackle problems of comprehension in literature?
Well, I actually had intended that as a question for the audience.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I will put it in the chat then. But I don't know if you have any thoughts for that.
I think that among the challenges in terms of reading comprehension, and particularly reading in the disciplines with literature as an example, is that teachers, and my work is primarily focused on middle school and high school, is that first, teachers don't have any assessments that would give them insights into the skills that students have with regard to the reading of literature, the kinds of outcomes that may be reported around literature, which is not often, are very broad, and they don't get at issues of processes at all. And I think that a major problem, both in the teaching of literature, but also teaching in other subject matters and just generic comprehension as well, is that the attention is on outcomes. What's the main idea? But if you don't have practices that model and support kids in creating representations of how they are making a sense, what features of the text am I paying attention to? What hypotheses do I have? How am I testing those out and trying to, to verify them? There are very few resources that get at that. I have been particularly influenced in my own work, ironically, by work in mathematics. One of the things we did in Project READI, because it was cross-disciplinary, is that we were working with people in other disciplines. And in mathematics, as one example, although READI wasn't in mathematics, but I've still pursued these relationships over the years, is that the teaching of mathematics is fundamentally tied to helping young people both create and understand canonical forms of representation that give you a window into how am I processing, how am I going about problem solving. And we have few of those resources. There's some in terms of sort of generic issues, but particularly in reading in the disciplines, they exist. There's a lot of work in history. Sam Weinberg's work, for example, Stanford History Group, as one set of efforts in history. There's really not very much of this work going on in the teaching of literature at all, and it's fundamentally absent from the assessment world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and part of me wonders too, like, are you thinking about assessments within the classroom or like the more larger scale assessments like NAEP?
Both. I think we need both. Teachers need formative assessments or at least templates, if you will, for formative assessments that go on from unit to unit, week to week, so that they can get feedback on how kids are developing, both in terms of strategy use, but also in terms of epistemological orientations. I mean, one of the things that I have found, I've taught at every level of the system over the last 50 plus years, particularly when kids get to middle school and high school, that they've been in this place called school for a long time. And quite often in the schools that we have our biggest concerns about, kids have internalized that this is a game. There's something in the teacher's head that they're waiting for me to say. I don't have any personal investment in the process. If I want to be active, then I'll try to figure out what he or she wants to say and give it back to him or her. And if I'm not, I'll just sort of sit back and let the game unfold. And if I'm really a strong personality, maybe I'll just resist and form a discipline problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It just makes me think of like the self-efficacy, motivation, engagement, and all of those things that kind of contribute to how students are taking assessments and what those scores mean if we're not really trying to make things engaging or accessible for students. So yeah, absolutely.
I'd also make one comment around NAEP, since you work on item development for NAEP. I currently am a part of the both vision and development panel for NAEP. Reading framework was originally 25, now it's to 2026.
Yes.
But one of the issues that we have been pushing as a transformation in the new framework is to include additional survey items as well as a task embedded in the actual assessment that actually get at kids' perceptions of their own self-efficacy, the relevance of the task that they're doing, as well as more detailed information on the context under which they are learning to read.
Yes, yeah. I think we've seen some of those in some of the draft framework development documents as well. But yeah, very, very exciting stuff
around that, right?
What?
And all the debates around that.
Yes, there have been quite a few debates. Speaking actually of NAEP, I know early in your presentation, I kind of noted that you were talking about how readability scores are not necessarily the best measure of, difficulty, text difficulty, or yeah. And I know, so I'm just curious to know, do you have any other sources or places that NAEP can look to try and understand text complexity? And because I know one facet we do use is readability, and it struck my curiosity of other potential sources that might be out there.
Well, there was a special issue of, I believe it was Elementary Journal several years ago, specifically on text complexity. And there were a number of specific recommendations around analyzing sources of text complexity. I also had been involved in the early years in the development of Common Core. And one of the things that I and others pushed in early phases of that work was specifically how Common Core was going to address issues of text complexity. And they sort of pushed off a sort of generic statement about qualitative indicators.
Okay.
But it hasn't been fully developed. I do think that the indicators that I have mentioned in my presentation around literature are concrete ways of engaging in analysis of sources of text complexity in literature. And we did develop a fairly robust assessment system in Project READI, and found that these indicators were important predictors because we would in some of our cases, we would use the same assessment with 9th graders and with 12th graders, and would find, for example, developmental appropriateness of the dimensions of complexity of characters, for example, or the dimensions of complexity in themes would matter in terms of how accessible the kinds of levels of competence that students displayed in the different grade levels wrestling with the same task and the same text.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. I'll have to look more into that too and share it with my reading colleagues. But wonderful. I think, I don't know, Caitlin, I know you're kind of in charge of the agenda and schedule. I think we're at the end of our breakout session time.
That's correct.
Okay. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I think this was very informative and very helpful for people to think through these critical issues. So
Well, thanks.
thank you.
Enjoyed.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.